Hey, Judge Wimes. Judge Wimes, I think you're on mute. I didn't hear you.
All right, I guess that's better. Hey, how are you
Okay.
doing?
Oh, good. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing pretty good for an old guy.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry we had to reschedule your time.
Yeah, and my apologies because I was and I had it, but then I have to, I'm leaving town um in a meeting in DC. So my apologies for that. And I don't know how I kind of missed that initially, but
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. Everything else going okay with you?
everything is, just busy, just like
How's,
everyone.
how's your wife?
She's doing good. She's doing good.
Okay.
Everyone's busy. The girls, I've got three, and they're all busy doing their own thing, but everyone's
Okay.
doing so I can't complain. How about you?
Everything's going okay. We've been busy with this stuff with the teams.
Right.
Um, that has been sucking up a lot of my time trying to get the sales tax renewed. But yeah,
Oh, when you say the teams, oh yeah, yeah, that's
yeah,
right.
yeah. So that is
We're
taking
okay.
up quite a bit of our time.
Yeah, yeah, I can imagine. Um, I forgot now. I'm trying to think because the latest, so did initially some county legislation get vetoed?
Yeah, so the county
Right.
executive vetoed our initial legislation, put it on the ballot, and we overrode him, and it's on the ballot in April.
Okay, so you did see, I didn't follow it. That's the thing. Sometimes you get up here and you lose track. And sometimes I
Yeah,
pay more attention to national news when, like they say, everything's local in politics.
yeah. So we were able to do that, and when I did it, because I was the lone sponsor for, you kind of look like the smartest guy in the room the next morning. Now that the Chiefs won the Super Bowl, because before they're like, "Oh, this is a horrible idea," and now
Right.
everybody's like, "Thank you for getting this done." So it's like,
Yeah. You're kind of basking in the glow. So,
yeah, it's
yeah.
like everybody, now you're the smartest guy in the room. So
Right. Right. Well, that's good. I think, for what it's worth, I think that's the right thing. I think we
yeah.
do need to be
Yeah.
moving forward.
So kind of, I don't know if Denise kind of gave you any overview of how this is going to go. Essentially, basically, it's just a free flowing conversation for about 40 minutes.
Okay.
So we'll spend the first 10 minutes. You can sort of talk about your journey. I know you were in Jackson County for a while.
Yeah.
Where
Yeah.
you went to law school, why you
Yeah.
went to law school, sort of like
Right.
your purpose, and then kind of what made you want to become a judge, and your role as a judge, what ideals and what is your mission, what's important to you, particularly as a federal judge. And then I'll just ask some kind of basic questions from
Sure.
there. So I think the first 10 to 12 minutes, kind of for you as a TED talk about you, right? Like
Okay.
about you, your role, how you got to where you were, what do you see as your purpose as a federal judge, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
We've got, I don't know if you saw the program, I don't know if Denise sent it to you. So not next week, but the week after, we're interviewing Judge Ramson from the Missouri
Oh,
Supreme Court. So,
okay. Yes. I finally had the opportunity to meet. I hadn't met her before, and we had a joint kind of meeting between the Western District of Missouri, Eastern District of Missouri, and the federal court and the Supreme Court justices. And
okay,
we were down in Jefferson City where we
okay.
met. So I had a chance to meet her for the first time and talk to her a little bit.
Yeah, so so and kind of I'll be asking questions, kind of what do you see the role of the courts and how the courts can be more diverse and kind of the age we're living in and your role with law enforcement and what you see that role should look like. So that's kind
Yep.
of the conversation we'll go with, and then we'll take some questions from the chat and then we'll kind of conclude from there.
Okay, great. Great. We'll,
Okay,
we'll-
Casey, you can tell me when we're ready to start.
Casey's out sick. You've got Joe today, but
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay,
as
thank
soon
you,
as you're
Joe.
ready, I'll go ahead and start this webinar. So if you guys are all thumbs up, I'll click the button.
Yep, we're ready to go.
All righty, here you go.
Hello and welcome to our second series for the Black History Month Lunch and Learn series. We have with us Judge Brian Wimes, who's a federal judge in the Western Court here in Missouri, and he has been serving as a judge for a number of years here. And before that, he was in the Jackson County courts. And so I think we are looking forward to hearing the discussion that you have to give with us, Judge, and you can go ahead and start. We'll turn it over to you. Welcome,
Well,
Judge.
thank you, Ron, for having me here. It's always my pleasure to talk, certainly during Black History Month, as we look at those in the community who, in very different ways, are hopefully impacting the community in a positive way and sharing their experience. I'll just tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up here in the Kansas City area, actually out south in Grandview, Missouri. Um, Sometimes I get the question, so I'll kind of answer this up front is how and why the bench? Well, initially that wasn't necessarily my goal. I never thought about that till later in my professional career as a prosecutor. But what did interest me very early on in life was public interest work, public service. Initially I wanted to be into politics. That is certainly a full contact sport nowadays. I'm very happy where I landed, but that was my initial intent. Why? Well, the reason was because you can impact your community. And I wanted to represent those and have a voice for those who may not have had a voice for themselves. So growing up, my dad, who wasn't in politics himself, supported local politicians, city councilmen, and that's how I became familiar with politics from that level. And also my dad, who was in real estate, impacted the community in another way because he sold real estate. And what he did, what I later learned he did in life, was to integrate neighborhoods around this metro area by houses he sold and putting African Americans in certain communities, integrating those communities. I learned that later, but my inspiration came very early on. I went to and graduated from the University of Kansas with a degree in political science. My intent necessarily was to look at local government. Initially, I thought about a master's of public administration. Miss Collins, who I interviewed kind of growing up, Joanne Collins, and we all know how much she means to this community, kind of inspired me to go in that direction. But also when I thought about public service, I did think about it one day running for office, and I said there is no better way to do that. And if you're going to be a legislator, you have to know a little something about the law. So that's when I started thinking about getting into law at that point. Eventually I did. I went to the Texas Southern Thurgood Marshall School of Law, which is one of four historically HBCUs in terms of a law school. Why there? Well, I've always went to majority schools, and I thought this was an opportunity, and I think it was a perfect time in my life where I want to see others who look like me, who have the same goals and aspirations, and it was a wonderful experience at Thurgood. My thought initially was, and I've always thought this, to get on the prosecutor's office, because I was going to use that kind of as my springboard into politics. Maybe one day be a prosecutor, then maybe. Okay, I'm not sure quite what happened, but we're
I
back.
don't know either. Yeah, I'm glad you're back. Okay, good.
Well, and long and short, so I wanted to get, I wanted to do, and I did prosecute for a number of years and held various positions in the prosecutor's office. But when I was thinking about running for office, timing wasn't right. So I looked around and saw what is it out there that I could do beyond prosecuting. I had been there 6 years. And then there was the opportunity in 2001 to become the drug court commissioner. And that was my first introduction to life on the bench. Although I wasn't a full jurisdiction judge, I still had the drug court, which I did for a number of years, and I really enjoyed my time there. But that really catapulted me from serving in a political way, in the sense of running for office, to what I call quasi, because we're certainly in the public. That's when I first had my interest in being on the bench. So in 2000, after 6 years as drug court commissioner, we all know Judge John Gray. He was moving from the bench, and it was an opportunity for me to apply, and I applied, and I was fortunate enough to be appointed to the 16th Judicial Circuit as a circuit judge. And from there, I was fine. I was doing well, and then opportunity came to come to the federal bench, probably in about 2010 in that process. And I won't bore us with that, but it was a long process, and I could talk about it later if it comes up within the questions. But long and short, an opportunity was available, and because of my relationship at the then Senator Claire McCaskill, who was my sponsor, for this position, I was able to, in 2012, be appointed by President Obama, which I'm very proud of, obviously, for being the first African American president and being appointed by him. And since then, I've been on the bench now for since 2012. So a little over going on 12 years coming up here in April. So that's my thumbnail, quick version of my background and kind of how I made it here to the federal bench.
Well, so a couple of questions. You hear about all the things that are going on with law enforcement and the courts. Can you talk about the transition that you dealt with coming from the state courts to the federal courts? How are they the same? How are they different? And the cases that you take on?
Yeah, there is a difference. Actually, what people may or may not realize, federal courts are courts of limited jurisdiction. So we only can hear certain type of cases. Those that arise under the Constitution, those that are involving federal statute, or those diversity of citizenship, meaning a citizen from Kansas and Missouri, and the threshold amount is over 75,000. Those are the ways in which we have jurisdiction. On the state level, as a circuit judge, we had jurisdiction over a whole range of things, including family court, which we don't do here in federal court. So that's the kind of substantive or jurisdictional difference. But other than that, the cases are different in that the criminal cases that you hear about day to day on the news is typically state court. We kind of deal with higher level in terms of drug offenses and other cases that are charged here. Our civil cases, again, we don't have quite the workload that I did have in state court. But the one thing that is not dissimilar is me on the bench. And I say that as an African-American male on the bench, a person of color on the bench, and the importance it is, whether it's state, whether it's local, state, or federal, that we have a bench that reflects the community it serves. And so from that standpoint, there is no difference because, I think when we have a bench that reflects our community, it in terms in the public as a whole, when they see people that look like you, it ensures that, hey, maybe this is a process where it's fair and it's colorblind, and I'm going to be judged just on the matter in front of this judge and not on anything else. So I think just the social visibility of being African American makes a huge difference.
So can you talk about sort of because a lot of people don't understand this. Can you give some context of how federal sentencing actually works? So how people are sentenced, and what does that look like when someone is convicted and then you're the judge that has to do the how long somebody's going to prison?
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, in state court, in federal court, it's more structured. Now I'll explain that in a second. In state court, you have your various crimes and various felonies, and you may have the background of the individual, which helps you make a determination where you're looking at the person as a whole. It makes a determination of how you might sentence. In federal court, we have what's called the sentencing guidelines, and everyone has heard that, where a sentence or a presumptive sentence is calculated. It used to be mandatory. For example, if you commit a certain crime, they'll look at your background, your history, your criminal history, and come up with a range that a typical person with that similar background could be sentenced between. Prior to me getting on the bench, it was mandatory. So the judges had no discretion. When a guideline was calculated, a judge would be required to sentence within that particular range, that formula that was decided. Now, since I've been on the bench, it's advisory. You start with the sentencing guidelines, but the court can go above that sentence, below that sentence, or within the sentencing guideline. It gives the courts a lot more flexibility in terms of how they impose a sentence. And although you have a guideline range, you can take into consideration that individual who is sitting in front of you, and you can take into their particularized situation to either sentence higher, lower, or within the guideline range.
So just thinking about what you're saying, so if prior to you coming on the court, if you had mandatory sentencing and you've been sentenced to say 20 years, right? And then they've changed the rules, and so you very well could have gotten maybe 10 years
Yeah.
for that same crime. What does that do for the people who basically had to go by the old rules?
Well, here's what happened, and that's a very good question. Because in terms of that, the mandatory minimum are set by Congress statute, and there are certain crimes where there are mandatory and minimum sentences. So even if the court had the flexibility, if by law, statutorily, you have this sentence, I can't go below that anyway because that would be in violation of the law. Now, what you're talking about, Duran, at times there may be certain statutes that are later amended, right?
Mhm.
So let's give an example where a mandatory minimum sentence may be 20 years. The statute, maybe certain legislation is passed, which lowers that from this mandatory 20 years to it may lower to, let's say 15 or 10 years, half of that 10 years. At that point, there are some statutes that act retroactively, which means this: the court can retroactively look at those cases, and it's not all circumstances, but look at those cases that where the individual may have been sentenced to the prior law, but now with the new legislation, the courts can look retroactively. And of course, that party would file something with the court to have us consider lowering the sentence based upon the change in the law. And under certain circumstances, then the court can go back, review the file, and decide to lower the sentence at that point in time. And in that case, it's kind of this retroactivity where you're looking back at those cases who may have been sentenced under that particular statute. But I will tell you that, and that's the restriction on the court, because we can't get around that. If there's a statute that gives us a prescribed amount of time, then obviously we're bound by the law and we're bound to sentence within that. There are certain provisions at times, a lot really, to be honest, depends on how the U.S. Attorney's Office charges crimes, which allows sometimes flexibility in the minimums and flexibility in how the court can sentence at that time. And so,
Judge, go ahead.
No, I was saying, so U.S. attorneys play a very important role in how you bring a type of case and how you charge type of case impacts the ability for the court to maybe do something or not do something.
So I know in the state courts, you as a judge have a lot of leeway. So when the two parties come together and have an agreement, say for a plea deal, the judge essentially has to sign off on that. Is that sort of the same feeling in the federal court, or not so much?
It is typically.
Okay.
Yeah, typically, if the parties have come to some agreement, then typically most courts will follow that agreement. If there's a question about it or the court has some question, then obviously they can talk with the parties about that. But I would suggest in most instances, the parties, these are negotiated pleas within those parties. And we don't know everything. Obviously, we know the facts. And but in terms of negotiations, we don't get involved in how and why a plea is. And so generally, we accept whatever their plea agreement was, and we'll go with that. However, if there's some level of unfairness or there's a question we have, then obviously we can do that. But that is the exception rather than the rule in terms of that. So in that sense, it's the same. I could tell you as a local prosecutor and as a state court judge, I'm really as a judge, I was always, and this is probably my time as a prosecutor, because we know why we entered into these agreements, and there could be a whole slew of reasons. So typically, I don't interfere with that process between the prosecutor and the defense attorney or the public defender, whoever the case may be, because I understand the nuances of cases and how they're charged, how they're brought, and there's a lot of times more than meets the eye on why they agreed at a certain amount of time or agreed to a plea.
And how long did you practice law before you got on the bench?
Isn't that something? I have been on the bench longer than I ever practiced law. So right out of law school, I worked for the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C., but I was in the Bureau of Prisons in the litigation section. And so we handled those civil actions that came out of the prison system when they would sue in the district, which was headquarters. So I did that for a year, but my goal was always to come back and be a prosecutor. And then I did that for 6 years. And so a total amount of practice time was 7 years before I was on the bench. But, you know, what I will tell you this, I think 7 years as a prosecutor are like dog years. I like to make that analogy because very early on, you are trying cases, you're involved. There's no kind of getting broken in period. I mean, they threw you right in. I think that was the best teacher for me and others and kind of helped build up my confidence and ability, especially when I got on the bench, because we're trial judges, right? When you're a trial judge, that's what you do is try cases. And I was very comfortable in the courtroom, very comfortable making evidentiary rulings because of my prior experience as a prosecutor.
Well, and I guess when I asked that question sort of in a leading way, but you know, what I've noticed about the practice of law itself is just in terms of if you're involved in the process, it's expensive.
Yeah.
So, you know, what can you do as a judge to help with the quality or the quantity of cases that say, you know, your legal aid would get, and some of those folks that have to help a lot of indigent clients that can't afford a lawyer, because oftentimes when people come in your courtroom as a state judge, as a federal judge, you know, they're faced with somebody who's got a humongous caseload. They don't really have the time to really help with someone because their caseloads, and that's not to impugn them as a lawyer, but they just have so many cases. And I know that that was a huge issue a number of years ago for the public defender's office here in the state of Missouri because the caseloads were just humongous. What can you as a judge or can the bench as a whole do to sort of assess with that, just because the cost of having a defense is so expensive?
Right, right. You know, we're limited in what we can do. I think, and I'll talk specifically about me in terms of that, and coming from the prosecutor's, office and recognizing the tremendous caseloads that defense attorneys may have. Um, um, Certainly the role that we play, and we've got to be careful because we can't get involved necessarily in the litigation of the matter in front of us. But what we can do is to ensure that that person is being represented fairly. Here in federal court, we have the CJA panel, which is the Criminal Justice Act, where we take federal public defenders have a certain caseload, but sometimes they get conflicted out. So we have a group of lawyers who are screened to be CJA attorneys who represent those clients that the federal public defenders can't represent. And so there has to be certain level of qualifications. And I just happen to be and have been for the last 2 years, the representative from the federal court who runs that program and helps screens attorneys that are coming in, that they have the background and the experience to represent the clients and give them that type of representation that we expect. That said, it does give me the opportunity in that role to diversify those attorneys who are representing this client, because primarily we see people of color, whether brown or black or brown skinned, and we are always looking to have lawyers who again represent our community, not only in color and sex, but in all kind of ways, and age, and who will represent fairly and qualified. to represent, to make sure they're ensuring the best representation they can get. And, that's what we do on the federal level. But it's different, you're right. And in federal level, we just don't have that caseload that you're talking about, experienced not federal public defender's office on the state level. But there are ways we try to, but we've got to be careful how involved that we get. But we certainly want to ensure that people who appear in our courtrooms are being represented the best, and they're able to put on a sufficient and fair defense and have the resources to do so, more importantly.
Right. And if you're just tuning in with us on our Black History Lunch and Learn, we've got with us Judge Brian Wimes of the federal court. Please feel free to put your question in the chat, and we will try to get to your question before our time ends with Judge Wimes. Judge, you kind of hit on a nerve too that we were talking about. It's kind of a two-part question.
Sure.
What can you as a federal judge, what can the bar do to diversify the pool of applicants that are coming into law school and eventually diversifying the bench, not just at the federal level and the state level?
Yeah, I think it's just got to be an intention. It has to be an intentional process. And let me tell you kind of in ways that I've tried to be, and I've been intentional. And I'm very proud of giving folks the opportunity. One is we've got to encourage those into law school to represent, whether it's on the private side or in the public interest field. But half of that battle, Duran, is when I have these school kids and groups that come in, they have to see it to believe it. And so what I try and do is bring them in, and they see African American judge. And that, if that sparks one or two kids, then that just social visibility helps in that sense. Other ways we do it is giving law students the experiences that I may not have had, didn't even know to have because I didn't know any better. We experienced to clerk and when you clerk, and I didn't have clerkship in my background, but certainly at the federal level and at the state level, you find a lot of judges who have that clerkship in their background and experience. And that here, especially on the federal side, it gives those the opportunity because I'm looking to diverse in color and in gender and all those other ways, so we can build this sort of legal profession and field that fosters this diverse group. Because those are the people who are reflecting the community. So you do it in the ways that you can, and certainly encouraging groups to enter the field of law, but then affording opportunities is the best way. But not only affording opportunities, and then I'll be quiet, but then availing myself to those who clerk for me and those who may not, to be mentors and advisors. And I'll talk about that in a second if you want me to, but that's an important aspect in the law, to have those people in your lives.
So one of the few facts that people don't know, and I was doing this research preparing for this interview, some people we actually know here locally, a lot of folks of color were appointed on the federal bench because of President Carter. And he put more women and minorities on the federal bench in his he only did 4 years because he didn't win his reelection. Actually, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed by him on the federal bench. And my question though is, do you see the growth? I mean, that was in the 1970s. Do you see a growth like that again of women and minorities coming to the federal bench in the last 4 years?
Well, you touch on a very important point where, at times, people may not be as focused on this third branch, the federal judiciary, but they have in more recent years. And because of appointments, and you see the critical nature, how those who are in the position to appoint plays a role in who sits on the bench. And so that is just critical. And even now, and I'm not taking any position, people have varying views about our courts, but you see the importance of how those who are in our legislations, those who are the executives of our states, those who are presidents, can impact the judiciary, which in turn impacts um, impacts the community. So when you say that, yes, I do see, but it ebbs and flows. I think, I think President Biden right now has a track record, and his track record is of he's diversifying the bench. I think I'm Obama appointment. I think president, but when you think about it, we didn't have a first African American judge was Fernando Gaitán, right? And that was in 1992 or 91. But that was George Bush who appointed him actually to the bench. I was the second African American all these years later in 2012 appointed by President Obama. So it's just important to be, it shows the importance of how the community has to stay involved in the political process and put people, and it's their choice who they put in these positions, but because they impact how this bench, it could impact how the bench reflects or doesn't reflect society.
And you mentioned a good point about how the third branch of government, the judiciary, is becoming more political. I had a conversation with Judge Robinson, who's on the Kansas side, who was appointed by George W. Bush to
Right.
the federal court in KCK. And she told me that she got 98 votes to be on the federal bench. So that means she had a pretty much broad array. Do you see a point in time where, post 2024, where the federal judges will get 97, 98 votes again, or is that time come and gone?
That's interesting. And I want to be clear, when I said politicize, I don't think the judges are politicized. I think the process is politicized. And here's what I mean by that. And I'm going to stand on my pulpit for a second. I think at times people are worried who appointed who, and that's going to impact the decision that person may have. I found most judges don't. Obviously, there are some outliers everywhere in terms of that. But I think you're appointed because, like I said, Judge Robinson was appointed by Bush. Judge Gaitán was appointed by Bush. I was appointed by Obama. And, what we see at that point in time is the law and how it impacts and how it's applied to a certain circumstance. I think what has happened is others now have looked at politicizing it more kind of outside in that who's being appointed to this position and who's appointed to these positions. And so in that sense, that has become, and you see it, very political. I would hope we could get back to the day where those in the legislature could see a person for who they are and their background and their skills to handle this job. I was appointed at 92-1. 92-1. And those days are just gone because everything is just, in that sense, is more politicized. So I'm not sure though, to answer your question, ultimately, I would hope we can get back that good people, good, smart people, hard workers who have the background to sit in these positions, get appointed these, despite kind of who you are, who people believe you may be affiliated with.
One of the questions in the chat asks, can you talk about any of the most difficult cases that you faced during this time that you learned from, I guess?
All cases are difficult. I mean, when you really sit back, because every decision we make, the daily decisions we make as I work with my law clerks and we're impacting someone's lives. And I really don't take that for granted. But sometimes you have to sit back and recognize the enormity of a situation. I can tell you this, and I'm not sure why, but it seems like in federal court, I do a lot of sentencing in criminal cases. And that just impacts you. I don't care who you are. It impacts when it's seemingly day in and day out. You have to make decisions on how long someone should remain in custody. You have victims, you have on one side, you have defendants, you have defendants' family. And you don't always judge them by their worst moment, and so that's a difficult to do. And we all take it, I know, very serious, and we all try to come out with the best sentence in light of the crime itself. But we look at the history and the background of the person who is in front of us, and try and make the best decision you can. So, I learn every day, you know. I learn every day. I learn to be a better judge. I think we're constantly evolving as judges. I constantly evolve. I'm a different judge now than I was 12 years ago on the federal bench. I just am. You just evolve and you try and become a better judge. And I think I have. You have the experience. You have, instinctively with your background, and so you rely on that. And obviously, you have the law you have to utilize as you make these decisions. But that's just the toughest part of the job. It's hard.
So, I know in your branch of government, you kind of, I wouldn't say self-monitor, that sort of thing. You've got your own set of rules. Do you see the judiciary from the federal side evolving, and what reforms can you talk about that the judiciary is making?
You know, it, I nothing we do can't go without going hand in hand with the legislation in Congress because we are reactionary in a way, the federal courts or courts in general, because we don't really come into play until something is, whether it's civil or criminal, something is before us. And we have to be careful how we can't be proactively out there because of our role. And we don't want the perception, or we should not have the perception somehow that we are compromised in some way because we can't be out there expressing our views on things because those are the certain type of matters that come before us. But I think there are things we can do, and I try and do. I think on an individual letter, again, I try and encourage those, and I think I have an obligation, and I can't always do it, to get out in the community and to talk about what we do on the bench. I think that's part of the biggest problem. There's this, we have to demystify what the bench is.
Right.
I will be, hopefully, in the next couple of years, I'll be coming on as the chief judge of the Western District. And and one of the things I want to make sure I do is to make sure I get out on a consistent basis in the public and talk about what we do here in the court. I think secondarily, me personally, you can get kind of lost in your day-to-day job here in the Western District of Missouri. But I've availed myself to national committees, national committee works, and committee work. And I know Judge Robinson has, I know Judge Guyton has, and you kind of know how the sausage is made, but secondarily, you can have an impact in a larger way. I sit on a committee now, which has broad discretion in a lot of things we do and how we recommend, and to be a voice in that room to help make sure we are still being mindful of issues as it relates to diversifying the federal judiciary and those things that are important, I know, to the community. I think I make it a personal obligation to get out there and to make sure I'm a part of trying to do something that ensures that we have a judiciary that is fair and that everyone from the outside looking in can see as fair.
What collaboration happens between other federal judges and, say, the Supreme Court, like with Judge Jackson and Judge Thomas, and in terms of judges of color?
You mean like any particularized groups that we have within?
Yeah.
For example, it started, I think, and that's a good question. Just the Beginning. Just Beginning is a program that was established by, I think, in the early 90s, African American judges, where we get together periodically every 2 years. But the program is one that brings in those in the community who may not have been exposed to the judiciary. So it's judges throughout the country, though, judges of color, but not only that, it's not only African Americans, it's women, it's LGBTQ groups. There's that we bring in and give opportunities to intern in our chambers. And in fact, they assign, it's a process where you go through and avail yourself. And you have the opportunity to get a student from, for example, a few years back, I had a student from the University of Indiana. She was an Asian student, a female, and it's a wonderful program to give opportunities to those who may not have those opportunities, which kind of puts them in the position to be exposed. And that's half the battle, just exposure to the law, so you can know how you want to interact with it ultimately as a professional and as a lawyer. So that's just one example.
So again, if you're tuning in, we're still taking a few questions for Judge Wimes. One of the things that I did wonder in your role as a federal judge, I know judicial safety has come up as a big issue in the last couple of years. What is Congress doing? What do you all do as a group in terms of safety for for the judges in the community? Because I imagine that there's been a lot of hostility the last several years, and I think of the judge in I think she was in New Jersey, where her husband and son were killed.
Yeah,
So, what does that look like in terms of your own personal safety?
it does. And those are the reminders. And the judge out of New Jersey, her son was killed, her husband was critically injured, and she has been a champion of judicial security on the federal level. And in fact, recently we had legislation passed which will allow our names to be removed from certain areas. And it's been something here in the state of Missouri to have our names, which contain our addresses, and removed. It remains a high priority. And because of that legislation, bipartisan legislation that passed in Congress, we were able to take up some measures which will provide better security for our personal residences. And so money was aside so we can, in terms of security at our home and for our families, which you're concerned about. It's always a concern. It's always a top priority that we're very mindful. And I think because my background coming from law enforcement, where prosecutors and that, it's always on the forefront of my mind, more so on a federal level because it's national. And so the threats can come from just far beyond our community. At least here in the state, I never had you're concerned about it, not a bigger fear because you're known to in the community. And I don't want to say that made me safer, but you certainly people know you in the community. But now, kind of with this overly charged environment we lived in, you're concerned. And, there have been um, times where, we've had to have the marshals step in and to do certain things to ensure security here and personally.
Yeah, that I think that is one of the things as being a public servant. I think is just really unfortunate that
Yeah,
you sort of put yourself out there and you have to worry about your personal security for not only you but your family. I
right.
think it's just really unfortunate where for you personally, but
Yeah, and you
um,
live in, and really as much. Yes, I worry about me, but you really worry about your family, your kids, and
yeah.
so you just have to be very careful and guarded with that type of information.
How many cases would you say you take on? I know you say you take these cases. How many cases would you say your caseload looks like in a month, or does that vary?
I can give you kind of generally my caseload. I think in terms of civil criminal cases over 200. I mean, no, I'm sorry, criminal cases a little over 200. I think civil a little bit more than that, maybe 100 more. And we're
Right.
constantly working those cases. So in a month, it just depends on scheduling. Civil cases, they're on this case management schedule I put them on. So, technically we have trials scheduled all the time, but most trials settle on the civil side and on the criminal side. Otherwise, it'd be very difficult to keep up. And we have a way kind of internally that um, that determines our caseload, but also determines what type of cases we get. For example, out of Jeff City, where we tend to get more of our cases that involve either Missouri or the Constitution, and we have to take up matters that way. Those are shared between all the judges and not just one judge. And so we have a way we call it the wheel that um, kind of regulates everyone has equal distribution of cases.
Well, Judge, we really appreciate you joining us for our second Lunch and Learn for this month. And I really appreciate you taking the time. Before we go and conclude, I asked this question, generally a fun question for all of our contestants. So let's take us back to the young Judge Wimes before he was a judge. What job did you actually want to do?
Really, it was becoming a prosecutor. It
Oh, okay.
was it initially. I mean, I wanted to get in politics, but I wanted to prosecute. Here's why. There's always this assumption. It was funny in law school. Some of my friends used to kid me. It's like, why do you want to be a prosecutor? You're putting, mostly African Americans in jail because that's who's getting charged with these crimes. And I said, first of all, there's a presumption somehow that people of color living in these communities want crime in their community. I said, those folks don't want to live in areas where those people were committing, and it's always a few that are committing the most crime. Secondarily, I think we need people of color who are throughout our criminal justice system, prosecutors, public defenders, judges, because then there are certain sensitivities that we're all aware of. And, you know, I used to always think that I did more good as a prosecutor in a lot of ways because you can control, you know, how charges are being filed, what's being filed. And so, you know, but that's the job. I was nervous when I came out of law school. I was like, okay, here's my job. I got it. Am I going to love this thing? But I ended up really enjoying my time there. And I think it was just wonderful experience for what I'm doing now, to be quite honest. That along with drug court, I really love that. But, you know, I can't say as a little kid, I wanted to be a judge. I was, you know, I wanted to be a politician and save the world. But I think as I started to mature, I'm actually doing what I want to do.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that. Any last remarks, Judge, and any concluding remarks you'd like to make?
Well, you know, you know, from my standpoint, I think it's just very important in my role with all the professional stuff I do that we have to always reach back and give those opportunities to individuals. And that's why I make it a point to be a mentor, an advisor, a sponsor of those in the legal community who may not be represented as they should, because I'm looking for the next person to take my job, to be quite honest. And we need to continue to think in those ways to make sure we have people who reflect. Again, that's my theme: reflect the community we serve.
Well, thank you, Judge Wimes. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule, and safe travels to DC.
Okay, thank you, and I appreciate it. Take care, Gerard.
Thank you. Bye bye.